The shot missed Caspian's head by 3 inches. He didn't scream. He didn't freeze. 12 years of running one of the city's most feared organizations had trained his body to move before his mind even finished processing danger. He dropped low, shoved his bodyguard Rayo out of the line of fire, and sprinted through a service alley as bullets chipped concrete behind him. By the time he reached the end of the block, his ear was ringing, and his silk jacket was torn at the shoulder. He tore off his tie, mussed his hair, and forced his breathing to slow. He needed to disappear, not as Caspian Vane, feared boss of the Vane Syndicate, but as a nobody, just another face in the morning rush. The nearest door belonged to a small café called Ariel's. He pushed inside like a man who had simply lost his way, not one who had almost lost his life. The smell hit him first. Cinnamon, roasted coffee, something sweet baking in the back. Warm light, mismatched chairs, a woman's laugh rising over the espresso machine's hiss. For a moment, the chaos outside felt like it belonged to a different world entirely. Behind the counter, a woman moved like she owned the room without needing to prove it. Curvy, confident, sleeves rolled to her elbows, she balanced 3 orders at once while calming an impatient customer with nothing but a steady voice and a half smile that made him forget he was angry. "Sir, I promise your croissant is worth the 40-second wait," she told him, and the man actually laughed. Caspian watched her the way he studied enemies, carefully, missing nothing. But there was no threat here, just a woman who seemed entirely, almost foolishly, unbothered by the weight of the world. He sat at the counter's far end, pulse still hammering beneath his calm exterior. 2 tables away, a man in a grey hoodie kept glancing toward the window, phone gripped too tightly in his hand. Caspian's instincts sharpened. Watcher or civilian? He filed the face away and forced his focus back to the woman pouring his coffee without being asked.
"You looked like you needed this,"
she said, sliding the cup toward him.
"Rough morning?"
"Something like that."
"Aren't they always?"
She wiped the counter, glancing at him only briefly. No recognition, no fear, nothing but simple human curiosity.
"You're new. Don't usually see suits in here before 8.
"I got lost," he said, which was, in its own strange way, the truest thing he'd said all week. She smiled, not the practiced customer service kind, but something real, and moved to the next order. He should have left. His security detail would be tearing apart 3 blocks looking for him, and staying in one place after an attack was a rookie mistake he hadn't made in over a decade. But something about her stillness kept him rooted to the stool. When she came back to refill his cup, he heard himself ask a question he had never asked anyone in his life. Not his captains, not his enemies, not even the men he trusted with his secrets. "Can I ask you something strange?" "Depends how strange." She didn't stop wiping the counter. "If someone offered you $20 million, enough to change your whole life, your family's whole life, to betray a complete stranger, would you do it?" Her hand paused for exactly 1 second. Then she looked up, and there was no calculation in her eyes, no greedy flicker, no performance for a stranger's benefit. "I'd rather lose every dollar I'll ever earn," she said simply, "than lose the ability to respect myself." She said it the way most people say the sky is blue, like it wasn't even a question worth debating. Caspian felt something shift in his chest, subtle but undeniable, like a lock turning after years of rust. He had built an empire out of understanding exactly what people would do for money. He had never once, in all those years, heard someone answer without a heartbeat of hesitation. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed violently in his pocket. Rayo, no doubt, panicking. Outside, a black SUV rolled slowly past the window. His window of safety was closing. He stood, dropped enough cash on the counter to cover 10 coffees, and turned to leave. "Wait," she called after him. "You didn't even drink it." He paused at the door, glancing back at her one last time. Some things are worth more than what's in the cup. Then he vanished into the morning crowd, melting into the city like he'd never been there at all. What he didn't see What Ariel didn't see either was the man in the grey hoodie quietly lowering his phone, a photo of Caspian's face now sent to someone waiting 3 blocks away. The man who had almost died that morning had just walked out of the one place in the city where, for reasons neither of them understood yet, he was safest of all. And the woman who saved his life with a single honest answer had no idea she'd just made herself a target. Caspian didn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse office on the 40th floor, city lights spread beneath him like scattered coins, and replayed her answer over and over until the words lost meaning and became just sound. I'd rather lose every dollar I'll ever earn than lose the ability to respect myself. He had heard men say they were loyal right before they sold him out. He had heard women swear devotion with a knife already hidden behind their back. He had never heard anyone say something like that and mean it. He wanted to know if she meant it. By morning, Rayo stood across from his desk, arms crossed, still irritated about the ambush no one had explained yet. "You disappeared for 40 minutes during an active threat," he said. "I had 6 men combing 3 blocks. Where did you go?" "A café." Rayo blinked. "A café. Get me everything on the owner, full background, discreet. No one touches her, no one approaches her. I want information, not attention." "This about the ambush?" "No," Caspian said, and left it there. Rayo didn't ask again. In 12 years, he'd learned which of his boss's silences meant drop it and which meant keep pushing. This one meant drop it. The file came back by evening, thinner than Caspian expected, and somehow heavier for it. Ariel Monroe, 29, no criminal record, not even a parking violation. She'd taken over the cafe from her aunt 4 years ago after it nearly closed, and had since turned it into the only profitable business on that entire block. She worked 16-hour days most weeks. Every second Sunday, she drove 2 hours upstate to see her mother, a widow with declining health, and left money behind each time, money the accounts showed she could barely spare. 3 evenings a week, she volunteered at a youth center a few blocks from the cafe, mentoring teenagers who had nowhere else to go after school. No debts hidden in shell accounts, no boyfriend with gambling problems, no family ties to anyone Caspian had ever done business with, legal or otherwise. She was, by every measure his organization used to judge people, uninteresting. Which was exactly what made her fascinating. He read the file twice, then set it down and stared at the skyline for a long time, feeling something close to guilt. He had built his entire life around the belief that everyone had a price, that loyalty was a performance people abandoned the moment the numbers got big enough. Ariel didn't fit the theory, and a man who had survived this long by trusting his theories didn't know what to do with the one person who broke it. He told himself he wouldn't go back. He went back 3 days later. She noticed him the second he walked in, not with alarm, just recognition, the kind reserved for a familiar face in an unfamiliar suit. "The mysterious lost man returns," she said, already reaching for a cup. "Find your way this time, or still wandering?" "Somewhere in between. That's most people, if they're honest." She set the coffee in front of him, black, no sugar, exactly how he'd taken it before, though he hadn't told her that. "You never gave me your name." "Does it matter?" "Not really. I just like knowing who I'm arguing with." "Are we arguing?" "Not yet. Give it time." She smiled, and he found himself smiling back before he realized it, an involuntary thing that hadn't happened in years. Their conversation that morning drifted somewhere he hadn't planned for. He asked why she stayed at the cafe instead of expanding into something bigger, somewhere that paid better for less exhausting hours. She asked why a man who dressed like money spent his mornings hiding in a cafe that clearly wasn't his usual world. He deflected. She let him, but her eyes told him she'd noticed the deflection and filed it away for later. "Let me ask you something," she said, wiping down the counter out of habit rather than need. "That question you asked me, the 20 million, why that number? Why not 10 or 50? Does the number matter?" "It tells me something about the person asking. 20 million isn't walk away and disappear money. It's change everything but still have to live with yourself money. That's a specific kind of cruel. Caspian went still. No one had ever picked apart the question like that. Not his lieutenants, not the handful of people he trusted with anything real. She'd looked past the number and found the intention behind it in under 10 seconds. "You think too much for someone who makes coffee," he said. "And you think too little for someone who clearly has a reason for asking strange questions to strangers." She leaned against the counter, studying him the way he usually studied other people. "You didn't come back for the coffee?" "No," he admitted. "I didn't." Neither of them said what that meant. She didn't push, and he didn't explain, and somehow the unfinished sentence felt more honest than anything either of them could have said out loud. He left before the morning rush thickened, the same way he had the first time, cash on the counter, no name given. But this time, as he stepped onto the sidewalk, he noticed something that hadn't been there 3 days earlier. A black sedan parked across the street, engine running, a driver who wasn't looking at the cafe, but at him. And beside the driver, a second man lifting a phone toward the window. Someone was watching, and this time, it wasn't one of his. The invitation arrived at the cafe on a Thursday morning, hand-delivered by a courier in a suit too expensive for the neighborhood. Ariel almost refused it, assuming it was a mistake, until she read the name printed at the top. A charity gala for children's education, hosted at the Levinson Art Gallery. Catering needed for 200 guests. The pay alone would cover 3 months of the cafe's rent. She said yes before she let herself overthink it. She didn't know the man funding half the gala's budget was the same one who'd been ordering black coffee and asking impossible questions for the past 2 weeks. The gallery on the night of the event looked like something out of a magazine. Marble floors, walls hung with paintings she couldn't have named the price of if she tried. Waiters gliding between clusters of people, wearing more jewelry than her entire building was worth. Ariel stayed near the kitchen doors, directing her small catering team, checking trays, keeping her head down the way she'd learned to in rooms like this. Rich people didn't want to see the person who made the food. They wanted the food to simply appear. She was refilling a dessert table when she heard his voice behind her, and every hair on her arms rose before she even turned around. "You clean up well for someone who spends her mornings covered in flour." She turned, and for a second, her mind refused to connect the man in front of her. Tailored black suit, easy confidence, a room full of people who straightened when he walked past, with the quiet stranger who'd sat at her counter asking about betrayal and money. "You," she said. "Me? You're—" She glanced around at the room, bending itself around his presence, at the way security seemed to orbit him without ever standing too close. "Who exactly are you?" "Caspian Vane," he said, watching her face carefully, the way he watched everything. She knew the name. Everyone in the city knew the name, the way people know which streets to avoid after dark. The Vane Syndicate wasn't rumor. It was headline. It was warning. It was the reason certain businesses stayed open and certain ones burned down overnight. Ariel took a step back without meaning to. "You're the man everyone says—" "Says a lot of things, most of it true." He didn't flinch from it, didn't dress it up. "I never lied to you. I just never told you everything." "There's a difference between not lying and being honest." "I'm aware." She should have walked away. Every instinct she owned told her to put distance between herself and a man whose name alone made grown businessmen lower their voices. But she remembered the question he'd asked her weeks ago, and the strange, quiet way he'd asked it. Not like a man testing her for sport, but like a man genuinely needing to know the answer existed somewhere in the world. That memory kept her feet planted. "Why did you really ask me that question?" she said. "The 20 million. "Because I needed to know if it was possible," he said quietly. "Someone who wouldn't sell out a stranger. I stopped believing people like that existed a long time ago." Before she could answer, one of his men appeared at his shoulder, murmuring something urgent. Caspian's expression shifted, the warmth folding closed like a door. "Excuse me," he said, and was gone into the crowd, back to being the man the room feared. Ariel stood alone by the dessert table, unsettled in a way she couldn't name. It was nearly an hour later, while she was outside by the loading entrance catching a breath of air, that a man in a grey suit approached her, polite, well-spoken, the kind of stranger who didn't belong lurking near a service door. "Miss Monroe," he said, and the fact that he knew her name sent ice through her chest. "My employer has a proposition. Nothing dangerous. We simply need to know Mr. Vane's schedule, where he goes, who he meets, when he's least protected. In exchange, we're prepared to offer more money than that café makes in 5 years." Ariel's mind flashed, unbidden, to a grey hoodie by a café window weeks ago, a phone lifted toward the glass. She hadn't thought about it since. She thought about it now.
"You've been watching me," she said. "Both of you. Him and whoever you work for."
"That's not an answer."
"It's the only one you're getting."
Her voice didn't shake, though her hands, tucked at her sides, had gone cold.
"I don't know what you think I am, but I'm not for sale. Not for 5 years of rent, not for 50.
The man's polite expression didn't change, which frightened her more than anger would have. "Everyone has a price, Miss Monroe."
"Then I guess I'm the exception,"
she said, and walked back inside without waiting to see his reaction. She didn't tell Caspian. She told herself it wasn't fear that stopped her. It was the simple fact that she barely knew him, that his world and her world weren't supposed to touch, that whatever this was between them didn't come with an obligation to report threats made in dark alleys. What she didn't know, walking back into the light and noise of the gallery, was that 30 feet away, hidden by a parked delivery van, a camera had captured the entire exchange. Her face, the stranger's face, and a photograph that would soon land on a desk belonging to someone far more dangerous than either of them realized. The photograph reached Caspian's desk 2 days later, slid across the polished wood by a man named Dario, one of his oldest captains, a man who had survived 3 regime changes before Caspian ever took power. Dario didn't say anything at first. He just watched Caspian's face as he looked at it. The image was grainy but clear enough. Ariel, standing near the loading entrance of the gallery, in close conversation with a man Caspian recognized instantly. One of Marchetti's people, a rival syndicate that had been circling Vane territory for the better part of a year. The same syndicate whose men had opened fire on him outside his own building weeks ago.
"When was this taken?" Caspian asked, voice flat.
"Night of the gala. Same night you had her working your event." Dario let that sit. "You wanted to know who's feeding Marchetti information about your schedule. Might be time to stop looking so far from home. She had nothing to do with the ambush. You don't know that." Dario's voice stayed respectful, but there was steel underneath it, the tone of a man who had buried friends because someone trusted the wrong person once. "You've known this woman a few weeks. I've known you 12 years. I'm not watching you get finished over a girl who serves coffee for a living." Caspian said nothing. He stared at the photograph until the edges of it blurred, until Ariel's face stopped looking like a stranger caught in a bad moment and started looking, against every instinct he had, like something he refused to believe. He had spent his entire adult life reading people. It was the one skill that had kept him alive through betrayals that had buried better men than him, and every read he'd ever taken on Ariel told him the same thing. She wasn't lying to him. But he also remembered, with a coldness that made his stomach turn, that the 2 people who had betrayed him worst in his life were the 2 he'd trusted most completely. He went to the café himself that evening, after closing, when the lights were dim and she was wiping down the last of the tables alone. She looked up when the bell rang, and her face brightened for half a second, before she read something in his expression that made the smile fall away. "What's wrong?" she asked. He set the photograph on the counter between them without a word. Ariel looked down at it, and Caspian watched her carefully, The same careful watching he'd used on 100 enemies before her, searching for the flicker of guilt, the tell, the crack in composure that meant a lie was coming. He saw none of it.
What he saw instead was her face going pale, then hardening into something closer to disbelief. "You think I did this," she said slowly. "You think I sold you out." "I think a man approached you that night, and you never mentioned it to me." "Because it wasn't your business to know every conversation I have in a night," she snapped, and the hurt in her voice cut sharper than anger would have. "That man cornered me by a service door and offered me money to spy on you. I told him no. I told him I wasn't for sale, and then I walked back inside and finished doing my job. And you," she said, jabbing a finger at the photo, "you're standing here treating me like a criminal because someone took a picture of me refusing to betray you." "I didn't say you betrayed me." "You didn't have to. You brought a photograph to my cafe at closing instead of just asking me what happened. That tells me everything about what you actually believe." Her voice cracked slightly, and she hated that it did. Hated that his opinion of her mattered enough to shake her. "You asked me once if I'd betray a stranger for $20 million. I gave you an honest answer. And the first time someone questions my loyalty, you don't even give me the benefit of the doubt you'd give a stranger." Caspian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Every argument he might have made, that his world didn't allow room for trust given freely, that a man in his position couldn't afford to believe without proof, that the photograph alone was enough to get most people finished in his line of work, sounded hollow even inside his own head. "I came here because I wanted to hear it from you," he said finally. "Not because I decided anything." "You came here with evidence in your hand, like you were building a case," Ariel said. "That's not someone keeping an open mind. That's someone who already decided and wanted me to prove him wrong." She untied her apron, folded it with hands that weren't quite steady, and set it on the counter like she was setting down something heavier than fabric. "I don't owe you an explanation for surviving a threat you didn't even know I faced," she said quietly. "If you've already made up your mind about who I am, then nothing I say tonight is going to change it, and I'm done trying to convince people I've already proven myself to." She walked past him toward the back office, leaving him alone in the half-lit café, with the photograph still lying on the counter between them. And for the first time in years, Caspian Vane had absolutely no idea what to do next. Ariel locked up the cafe alone that night, later than usual, her mind still tangled in the argument she couldn't shake. She barely noticed the van parked across the street until its side door slid open and two men stepped out, moving fast and practiced, the kind of practice that came from doing this more than once. She didn't even have time to scream properly before a hand clamped over her mouth and the world tilted sideways. When she woke, her wrists were bound to a metal chair, the air around her thick with rust and motor oil. Dim light filtered through broken windows high above, and the shapes of forgotten machinery loomed in the shadows. An old warehouse, abandoned long enough that dust coated every surface like a second skin. Her head throbbed, her mouth tasted like copper. Two men stood near a doorway, arguing in low voices, careless in the way people get when they assume their captive is still unconscious. Ariel kept her breathing slow and even, eyes barely open, and listened. "Boss wants Vane here by midnight or she gets hurt. Simple as that." "He'll come. Machete said he always comes for the ones he cares about. That's his weakness." "Then we use it." Ariel's pulse spiked, but she forced her body still. They thought Caspian would walk into a trap for her, after the way they'd left things. After the accusations still hanging bitter in her memory, she wasn't even certain he would come at all. But some colder, clearer part of her mind pushed the doubt aside. Feelings didn't matter right now. Surviving did. She catalogued everything she could without moving her head. A loading door to the east, chained shut. A support beam near the second man, marked with faded numbers. A unit designation, maybe.
something that could identify the building. A folded blueprint, half visible in an open bag by the door, edges of a floor plan she memorized in the few seconds she dared to look. When one of the men finally left to make a call, she worked her bound hands against a loose bolt on the chair's armrest, quietly, patiently, until she managed to pry a small metal washer free without either of them noticing. She dropped it near the leg of the chair, then, with the toe of her shoe, nudged a second object she'd spotted on the floor, a crushed cigarette pack bearing a logo she recognized from a gas station 3 blocks from a warehouse district she knew well from her volunteer runs upstate. She kicked it toward a gap in the floorboards, hoping, praying, that if anyone searched this place later, they'd find the trail she was leaving behind like breadcrumbs in a story she refused to let end badly. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The men grew restless, snapping at each other, checking phones that gave them no comfort. Ariel kept her face blank, kept listening, kept memorizing every scrap of information that passed between them. Names half-spoken, a warehouse code, mention of a second location nearby where Marchetti's people stored something they called the shipment. She didn't know Caspian was already 3 streets away. He'd gotten the call an hour after she vanished, not a ransom demand, but a taunt. Marchetti's voice dripping with satisfaction over the phone, telling him exactly what he wanted him to feel. Caspian hadn't hesitated, hadn't called a council meeting, hadn't weighed the political cost of moving against Marchetti without full backup. He'd grabbed Rayo, Dario, and 6 trusted men and started tearing through every warehouse the syndicate could trace back to Marchetti's known properties. It was Dario, of all people, who found the thread. A supplier's delivery log showing a gas station 3 blocks from an old industrial warehouse, cross-referenced with a note about foot traffic near a chained loading door that hadn't been used in years. Small details, the kind only someone deliberately leaving a trail would think to plant. "She's smart," Dario muttered, staring at the map. "Smarter than we gave her credit for." Caspian didn't answer. He was already moving. They hit the warehouse just before 2 in the morning, quiet and precise, cutting power to the block before breaching the east entrance. The 2 guards never had a chance to raise an alarm. Caspian found Ariel exactly where the trail suggested she'd be, chair still upright, eyes sharp and furious rather than broken. He cut her ropes himself, hands faster than he meant them to be, voice rougher than he intended when he asked if she was hurt. "I'm fine," she said, rubbing her wrists, refusing to let her voice shake in front of him. "I left you clues. The cigarette pack, the washer by the chair leg. Did anyone even notice?" "Dario found the gas station," he admitted. "The rest we found because we were looking for you specifically, not evidence." She let out a short, disbelieving laugh, exhaustion and adrenaline colliding. "I sat in that chair for hours, planning an escape route for a man who thought I sold him out." "I know." Caspian's jaw tightened, something raw moving behind his eyes. "You didn't have to do any of it. You could have just waited." "I don't wait to be saved," she said. "I never have." He looked at her for a long moment, bruised wrist, dirt smudged across her cheek, spine straight despite everything, and understood, with a clarity that hit harder than any bullet ever had, that she had never once, in the entire ordeal, given the enemy a single piece of information that could hurt him. She hadn't betrayed him, not when it was easy, not when it would have saved her. And Caspian, staring at the proof of it standing right in front of him, finally allowed himself to believe. Caspian didn't take her home after the warehouse. Home wasn't safe, not with Marchetti's people still combing the city, not with Dario's captains already whispering about how far their boss had gone for a woman who wasn't even syndicate. Instead, he took her 2 hours north, to a lakeside property so quiet and unmarked that even Rayo needed the coordinates written down instead of trusting memory. The cabin sat at the edge of still water, pine trees pressing close on every side, no neighbors for miles. It belonged to no one on paper, a property Caspian had bought years ago under a name that didn't exist, for exactly this purpose, though he'd never actually used it before.
Ariel stood in the doorway that first morning, watching mist rise off the lake, arms wrapped around a mug of coffee she hadn't touched.
"You built a hideaway and never used it," she said. "That's either very smart or very lonely. Maybe both." She glanced back at him, surprised by the honesty. He'd been doing that more since the warehouse, answering instead of deflecting, like something in him had cracked open and he'd decided, finally, to stop patching it shut. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following days. She cooked, refusing to let him touch the stove after he nearly burned rice on the first try. He fixed the dock, the porch railing, things that didn't need fixing, because his hands needed something to do besides sit still. In the evenings, they sat by the water with 2 chairs pulled close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and talked in a way neither of them had talked to anyone in years. It was on the 3rd night that she finally asked the question she'd been holding back since the gallery. "Why don't you trust people? Really trust them, I mean, not the surface kind." Caspian was quiet for a long moment, staring at the black water. "My father built the syndicate before me. When I was 19, his second-in-command, a man who'd known me since I was little, taught me how to shoot, sat at our table every Sunday, sold him out to a rival family for less money than you'd think a life was worth. My father didn't see it coming. I watched him die because he trusted someone he shouldn't have. I'm sorry. I'm not finished." His voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone raw. "I took over at 20. Within 2 years, I learned 3 more people close to me were feeding information to enemies. One of them, a woman I thought I loved. After that, I stopped believing loyalty existed without a price attached. I built my entire life around that belief. It kept me alive. And now? Now I met someone who turned down $20 million without blinking, then got kidnapped and spent the whole time leaving me clues instead of begging for mercy or giving up my location."
He turned to look at her, and there was nothing guarded in his expression, nothing calculating.
"You've spent weeks breaking a rule I thought was unbreakable."
Ariel felt something tighten in her chest, something she'd been fighting since the café, since the first strange question he'd asked her. "You still doubted me, though, when you brought that photograph."
"I know.
He didn't try to excuse it.
And I hated myself for it the second I saw your face. You'd already proven who you are, over and over, and I still let 12 years of other people's betrayals speak louder than the woman standing in front of me."
"That's the difference between us," she said quietly. "I grew up watching my mother work 3 jobs after my father died, and I never once saw her cut corners, never saw her cheat anyone."
Even when it would have been easier. She taught me that who you are when no one's checking is the only thing that actually matters. I never had a reason not to trust that. You're lucky. I know I am. She reached over, without quite deciding to, and laid her hand over his on the arm of the chair. But I don't think trust is luck, Caspian. I think it's a choice people keep making over and over, even after they've been hurt. You just stopped making it a long time ago." He looked down at her hand on his, then back up at her face, lit gold by the last of the sunset over the lake. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple. It's just necessary." She smiled, small and unguarded. "You saved my life. You believed me when it counted, even if it took you a beat longer than it should have. That's not nothing." Something shifted between them then, slow and undeniable, the kind of silence that says more than words could. Caspian reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't calculating anyone's angle, wasn't watching for a lie, wasn't bracing for betrayal. He was simply looking at her. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Trusting someone, letting them matter this much." "Then we figure it out together," she said. "One honest answer at a time." When he kissed her,
It wasn't the careful, guarded thing either of them might have expected from two people who'd spent their lives building walls. It was something that had been building since a strange question in a quiet café finally allowed to become what it always was. Outside, the lake stayed still and dark, holding no answers about what waited for them back in the city, only the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would face it having finally chosen each other, walls and all. They returned to the city 5 days later, and Caspian was a different man in ways only he seemed to notice at first. He called a meeting with his top 3 captains, Dario included, in the private room above one of his legitimate businesses, a shipping company that had always served as convenient cover for less legal cargo. He laid out his plan with the same calm precision he used for everything else, as if he were discussing quarterly numbers instead of dismantling an empire built on fear. "We're cutting the trafficking routes," he said, "effective immediately. The extortion contracts on the East Side businesses end this month, every one of them. I want the illegal accounts frozen and the money moved into legitimate channels within 30 days. Silence answered him first, then disbelief, then the beginning of anger.
"You want to gut the entire operation," Dario said slowly, "because of a woman."
"I want to gut the entire operation because I'm done building a life I have to hide from everyone I care about," Caspian said. "My father built this on fear. I inherited fear. I'm tired of it." "Fear is what's kept you alive," said Renzo, the youngest of the captains, sharper-tongued than the others. "You think Marchetti's people are going to respect weakness? You think the families who feared us for a decade are just going to let you walk away clean? I didn't say it would be easy. I said it's happening." The meeting ended without agreement, which, in Caspian's world, was its own kind of warning. Men who disagreed quietly were far more dangerous than men who argued loudly. He knew that. He proceeded anyway. Over the following 2 weeks, he moved with a discipline that surprised even Rayo, who had followed him without question for years. Trafficking routes shut down one by one, the operations behind them dismantled, and reported anonymously to law enforcement contacts who owed Caspian favors older than some of his captains. Extortion contracts were quietly torn up, business owners receiving confused, relieved phone calls informing them their monthly payments were no longer required. Illegal accounts, hidden behind shell corporations built over a decade, were slowly funneled into legitimate holdings, real estate, shipping, a growing stake in renewable energy that Caspian had once dismissed as a waste of capital and now saw as something closer to atonement. Ariel watched it happen from the sidelines, careful not to push, though she couldn't deny the quiet pride that settled in her chest every time he told her about another piece of his old life falling away. Her café had grown busier too, word of the gala catering job spreading through the kind of circles that meant real money, real opportunity. 2 new hires, a second location already being scouted 3 blocks over. "You're doing this too fast," she told him one evening, watching him work through documents spread across her kitchen table, the cafe closed for the night. "Men like Dario don't disappear quietly just because you asked nicely." "I know. Then why not slow down? Protect yourself first." "Because every day I wait is another day someone else gets hurt by something I built," he said, not looking up from the papers. "I spent 12 years telling myself the violence was necessary, that the fear kept order, that people needed to be controlled or they'd tear each other apart. I don't believe that anymore. Maybe I never really did. I just needed a reason to stop pretending." She sat across from him, chin resting on her hand, watching the man who used to intimidate rooms simply by entering them, now hunched over spreadsheets like an overworked accountant. "You're not the man I met in my cafe anymore." "Is that a problem?" "No," she smiled. "I think that man was hiding this one the whole time. I just got to see him show up early." But not everyone shared her optimism. 3 nights later, Dario called an emergency meeting of his own, one Caspian wasn't invited to. Renzo attended. So did 2 other captains whose loyalty Caspian had never questioned, Men who'd stood beside him through wars with rival families. Men he would have trusted with his life a month ago.
"He's not thinking clearly," Dario told them, voice low in a private back room that smelled of cigars and old resentment. 12 years, and he throws it away because a woman made him feel guilty over dinner. We built this. Our families depend on this. I'm not watching everything I've worked for burn because Caspian found a conscience. "What do you propose?" Renzo asked. "We remind him what matters," Dario said. "And if he won't listen to reason, we remind him what he stands to lose." The room went quiet, each man understanding exactly what that meant without needing it said aloud. Caspian, oblivious to the meeting happening 3 floors below his own office, spent that same night finalizing paperwork for the last of the frozen accounts, feeling lighter than he had in over a decade. He called Ariel just past midnight, her voice sleepy and warm through the phone.
"It's done," he told her. "The last of it. I'm out."
How does it feel? He thought about it, staring out at the city lights he no longer needed to control through fear. Like I finally get to find out who I actually am, instead of who I built myself to be. Neither of them knew, in that quiet, hopeful moment, that Dario and his allies had already begun planning something that would test everything Caspian had just claimed to believe, and that the price of his newfound conscience was about to come due in a way neither of them could have predicted. They took her from the youth center parking lot just after dusk, 3 men in a dark van who clearly weren't strangers to this kind of work. Ariel didn't fight this time. She'd learned enough from the warehouse to know when resistance was pointless and when patience was a weapon. She let them bind her wrists, let them blindfold her, and spent the entire ride memorizing turns, counting seconds, filing away every detail her mind could hold on to. When the blindfold came off, she was sitting in the basement of what looked like an old courthouse, marble floors gone gray with dust, the kind of building the city had forgotten existed. Dario stood a few feet away, and the sight of him confirmed what some quiet part of her had already suspected the moment the van door slid open. "You," she said. "Caspian trusts you more than anyone." "Caspian trusted a lot of people," Dario said. "Trust doesn't keep an empire standing. Fear does. He forgot that the moment he met you." "So this is my fault?" "This is a correction," Dario said. He surrenders control back to the people who actually understand how to run this organization, or he watches what happens to you. Simple as that. They left her alone in the room after that, save for one guard by the door, careless with his phone the way men often were when they assumed a bound woman posed no threat. Ariel kept her wrists loose enough to work quietly, and inside her jacket pocket, untouched by anyone who'd searched her in a hurry, sat the small recorder she'd started carrying after the warehouse, a habit born from a promise to herself that she'd never again be caught without evidence. She'd turned it on the moment the van doors opened. Over the next hour, as different men drifted in and out of the room to check on her, to argue amongst themselves about timing and next steps, Ariel listened and recorded everything. Dario's voice, clearest of all, laying out plans to force Caspian's surrender. And then, almost carelessly, a detail that made her blood run cold. "Same as we did with Marchetti's people 6 weeks ago," one of the younger men muttered. "Feed him just enough intel to make the ambush look convincing. Let the vain boy think it's a rival move. Keep our hands clean." Ariel's mind flashed instantly to the gunfire outside Caspian's building. The assassination attempt that had first driven him into her café. She kept her face perfectly still, though inside, something clicked into place with sickening clarity. Dario hadn't just turned against Caspian recently. He'd been undermining him from the very beginning, orchestrating the ambush that started everything, using Marchetti as cover, positioning himself as the loyal captain while quietly building toward exactly this moment. Caspian had never doubted the wrong man. He'd simply doubted the right one too late. When Dario returned to check on her progress, Ariel kept her voice calm, buying time. "He'll never give up control. Not to save me, not to save himself."
He will, Dario said. Love makes men foolish. I've seen it before. His father was the same way once.
And if he doesn't?
Dario's silence answered the question well enough. The rescue came just after midnight, though it wasn't the rescue Dario expected. Caspian arrived with Rayo and a small team, yes, but he also arrived with 2 undercover officers from a task force he'd quietly been feeding information to for the past 3 weeks, part of the legitimate transition he'd been building since the lakeside cabin.
He hadn't told anyone but Rayo, not even Ario.
The breach was fast and clean. By the time Dario realized what was happening, half his men had already surrendered under the threat of federal charges stacked high enough to bury 3 generations, and the other half had simply run. Caspian found Ariel exactly where the guard's careless phone location had led him. Rayo had traced the signal within an hour of her disappearance, another quiet skill Caspian had insisted his people develop once he decided to leave the old ways of finding people behind. He cut her ropes with steady hands, checking her face, her wrists, the same careful assessment as the warehouse months before.
I'm fine, she said, before he could ask. Then, quieter. Caspian, it was Dario. The ambush that first day, outside your building, he arranged it. He's been building toward this from the beginning.
Caspian went very still. You're certain? I have it recorded, every word. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Not disbelief this time, not hesitation, just a quiet, devastating acceptance of a truth he'd apparently already begun to suspect on his own. I started wondering 3 days ago, he admitted. Small things, timing that didn't add up. I didn't want to believe it. I know the feeling, she said gently. The evidence Ariel carried out of that basement, recorded confessions, names, dates, the entire architecture of a betrayal that stretched back to the very first gunshot of this story, became the foundation for a coordinated operation between Caspian's remaining loyal captains and the federal task force he'd been quietly courting for weeks.
Within 72 hours, the conspiracy that had shadowed both their lives since that first morning in the café collapsed entirely. Arrests made, assets seized, the last remnants of the old empire finally, truly dismantled. Standing outside the courthouse as dawn broke over the city, Caspian took Ariel's hand, still marked faintly with rope burns she refused to complain about. You saved my life twice now, he said. 3rd time's the charm, she said. And for the first time since the gunfire that started everything, they both allowed themselves to believe the danger was finally, truly over. 1 year is enough time to rebuild a life, if you're willing to do the work. Caspian's transformation from feared boss to ordinary businessman hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't happened without cost. There were months of legal proceedings, testimony given quietly behind closed doors, deals struck with prosecutors who valued the dismantling of Marchetti's network and Dario's conspiracy more than they valued punishing a man who'd voluntarily handed them the evidence to do it. His legitimate businesses, shipping, real estate, the renewable energy stake he'd once dismissed, had grown into something he was almost proud to put his name on. The vain name still carried weight in the city, but it meant something different now. Fewer people lowered their voices when they said it. More people simply nodded, the way you'd acknowledge any other successful businessman who'd earned his place. Ariel's Café hadn't just survived, it had multiplied. What started as one struggling shop on a forgotten block had become 4 locations across the city, each one hiring from the same youth center she'd volunteered at for years, each one setting aside a portion of its profits for scholarships that sent kids from that neighborhood to colleges they'd never imagined affording. She still worked the counter some mornings, sleeves rolled up, refusing every suggestion from her business partners that she was too important for that anymore. Some things, she said, you don't outgrow. You just get better at holding on to them. On a quiet Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after a gunshot had first sent a desperate stranger stumbling through her door, Caspian walked into the original café, the bell above the entrance ringing the same way it always had.
Ariel looked up from behind the counter, and something in her chest warmed the way it still did every time she saw him, even after a year of mornings just like this one.
"You're late," she said. "The usual table's getting cold." "Some things are worth the wait," he smiled, the same smile she'd learned to trust, slowly, deliberately, one honest conversation at a time. They sat at the same counter stool where it had all started. She'd never let anyone else move it, had kept it in that exact spot through 2 renovations, though she'd never told him why until months into their relationship. He'd laughed when she finally admitted it, something warm and disbelieving, like he still couldn't quite accept that a stranger's question in a moment of panic had somehow become the foundation of an entire life. "I have something to ask you," Caspian said, turning his cup slowly between his hands, an old habit she recognized as nerves he rarely let himself show. "Depends how strange," she said, echoing words a year old now, worn smooth and familiar between them like a stone carried in a pocket. "If I asked you to build a future with me," he said, "not protect me, not save me from myself or my past, just build something ordinary, something that's just ours, no danger, no secrets, no photographs waiting to ruin everything, what would your answer be?" Ariel set down the rag she'd been using to wipe the counter, the same small, habitual motion she'd made the very first morning he walked in, and looked at him with the same steadiness that had first caught his attention a year ago. "That answer was decided," she said, "the day you finally believed that not everyone has a price." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, plain and unassuming, nothing like the diamonds his old world would have expected him to offer. Inside sat a simple ring, understated, the kind of thing a woman who'd built an empire out of coffee and honesty and stubborn integrity would actually choose to wear every day. "I don't have $20 million to offer you," he said. "I gave most of it away, remember?"
"I never wanted the 20 million, she said, laughing despite the tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "I just wanted someone who'd believe me when it mattered." "I believe you," he said. "Every day since the warehouse, every day since the basement, every single morning you've walked into this cafe and looked at me like I'm just a man who got lost and found his way to the right door." "You are that man," she said, sliding her hand into his over the counter, exactly where it had first landed months ago, over a lake that had held their secrets in silence. "You always were. You just needed someone to remind you." Outside, the city moved on the way it always did, indifferent to the quiet miracle happening inside a small cafe on a forgotten block, a mafia boss who traded fear for honesty, and a woman whose one unshaken answer had unraveled an empire built on betrayal and rebuilt something better in its place. She said yes before he even finished the question, the same way she'd answered his very first one, without hesitation, without calculation, because some truths don't need time to become certain. Caspian Vane, once the most feared name in the city, sat at a small counter, holding the hand of a woman who had never once, in the entire year he'd known her, given him a reason to doubt her. And for the first time in his life, he understood that trust wasn't a weakness men like his father had died from. It was the only thing, in the end, worth building anything on at all.